Good afternoon, friends. Today I'm going to talk about what the budget, Union Budget 2012-13 means for SMEs like you and me. I'm going to deal with this presentation in two parts. The first part is dealing with some of the basics on budget making, what a budget is, how it is presented, and what we normally expect to find in the budget. And the second part would be on how it will specifically on what are the specific provisions in the budget that will impact SMEs in one way or another. So what is the budget? The budget is an estimate of inflows and outflows of the government for a year. It is usually presented for the ensuing financial year. So it consists of, what does the budget statement actually consist of? So it consists of actual figures for the preceding years. So for example, when the finance minister presents the budget in February 2012, he would be presenting the actual figures for 2009 and 10. He would be presenting the actual figures for 10 and 11, revised estimates for 10 and 11, and he would be presenting the budget estimates for the provisional figures for 11 and 12, and the budget estimates for 12-13. So all the proposals, for example, the expenditure proposals and the tax proposals for the ensuing year, that is 12-13, would be effective from the 1st of April. The budget is usually, by convention, presented on the last working day of February. There's an extensive exercise which normally starts at least 3 or 4 months in advance. There are consultations with peer pressure groups, with various interest groups, industry, business, policymakers, and so on, different ministries. And the timetable is drawn up by the Budget Advisory Committee, and they fix a period for discussion within each ministry. The ultimate responsibility is the budget division in the Finance Ministry. What happens if the budget is not approved by the 1st of April? If the budget is not approved by the 1st of April, there is a constitutional impasse. So therefore, the Constitution has a provision which empowers the Lok Sabha to grant a vote on account so that government can continue to function with the expenses required only for the next 2 months till the time that the budget is passed. Therefore, which in effect means that the budget for any financial year has to be necessarily completed by the end of May for this financial year. Now, as the finance minister addresses Parliament, reads out his budget speech, he also covers some of the approaches, the constraints, the various aspects that have gone into the making of the budget. And the finance minister stated this year that recovery was interrupted because of the intensification of the debt crisis in the Eurozone, political turmoil in the Middle East, rise in crude oil price, earthquake in Japan. So global factors which have affected budget making. He also gave an overview of the fact that the GDP is estimated to grow by 6.9% in the current financial year, after it had grown at 8.4% in the 2 preceding years. In spite of the slow growth and the negative, the fall in the growth rate, he wanted to portray a picture of optimism and therefore said that India remains a front runner in economic growth in comparison with many other countries in the world. Another problem that persisted during the last financial year was a very high domestic inflation rate, and therefore monetary and fiscal policy had to respond for a better part of the year aimed at keeping inflation under control. So liquidity was tight. There was supposedly curbs on expenditure in order to check domestic inflation. And growth was moderated and fiscal balance deteriorated as a result of the tight monetary policy. Growth was moderated, and that was one of the reasons that was cited for the lower growth rate. Now, what do we normally expect to find? Every year in a budget, there are some large proposals for various programs, policies, and what we expect to find through these announcements are clear indications from the government on matters like administration reforms, tax reforms, disinvestment policy, uh, creating an enabling investment climate in the country, the policy on subsidies, and so on. We now move on directly to the impact of the budget on SMEs. Now, before we start, the area that is of most interest to most of us is taxes. So it's important to know that taxes in India are levied at three levels. One is the central level, the second is at the state level, and finally at the local level. The focus of the union budget is clearly on the central taxes, the direct and indirect taxes. The direct taxes being capital gains, personal income tax, and tax on corporate income, and indirect taxes in the form of customs duties, central excise, and service tax. Now, when we talk about ease of doing business and how does the budget address issues related to ease of doing business for SMEs, we really look at certain specific areas which announcements in the form of either setting up of trade or business promotion bodies, so new bodies being created, or additional funds, the budgetary provision for certain departments for promotion of trade or investment activity increasing. There are policies which make announcement of policies making joint ventures, collaborations, and access to capital easier. There are sometimes announcements regarding grants and subsidies or low-cost funding to be made available to small-scale sector or specified industries. And there are also announcements related to regulatory oversight and providing tax breaks or tax reliefs or lower tax rates for small and medium businesses. Every budget would probably have something. If a budget has to be complete, it would have announcements in one or all these areas in one form or another. So what did we find? Specifically, what kind of provisions were mentioned in this budget which would have an effect of making business easier for small and medium companies in India? So very clearly, there were two items which stood out. One was the increase in the turnover limit for compulsory tax audit of accounts as well as for presumptive tax, minimum alternate tax payment, increased from 60 lakhs to 1 crore. So this makes life easier for those companies which have still not achieved the 1 crore turnover level. The second being the exemption from capital gains on sale of residential property. If the sale proceeds are used for subscribing to the equity share capital of your company, and the money in turn being used for buying plant and machinery. So this helps capital formation at the level of small, medium-sized companies where access to capital is difficult from the traditional sources of funding like banks or venture capital funds. But you can sell your property and you will not be taxed if you are using that money to invest in your business. Other than that, there is nothing else in the budget that would mitigate the pressure of high cost of infrastructure. Setting up a business is costly and it's getting costlier by the day. There is no provision, nothing at all, no relief in this budget which specifically aims to ease that pressure for MSMEs. There are certain announcements like grants to research institutions. The government, the finance minister listed out 10 institutions including Irma and Anand, Kerala Agricultural University, Agricultural Sciences, University of Agricultural Sciences at Dharwad, aggregating to about 460 crores of grants to these institutions. So those of you who are collaborating with them or if you have any kind of an incubation with them or you are supplying to them, you could find an indirect benefit because payments would be easier to flow and they would have additional funding, so they would probably give you more business. The other feature that looks clearly attractive for MSMEs, especially in the media and education sectors, content development and so on, is the additional funding to the NSDC. So large opportunities, the opportunities for small and medium-sized companies who are currently in the ecosystem of as service providers for those entities which are being funded by NSDC should have expansion of business. There is an announcement which he made about requiring the central public sector undertakings to make a minimum of 20% of their annual purchases from small medium enterprises. Now this is only a direction, it's a guideline, it's not a mandatory, so we will need to watch how this is implemented as the years go by. Otherwise, the increase in standard excise duty from 10% to 12% will directly increase the cost of inputs, cutting across sectors. Also, the increase in service tax from 10% to 12%, except for 17 specific services, will adversely impact SMEs because it will be difficult to pass on this additional 2% service tax to customers given the increasing competition in most sectors. So some of these services that are in the negative list are admission, as mentioned earlier, the negative list of 17 services which have been exempted from the purview of service tax. So not only has the rate increased, but also the businesses or sectors, the services that are under the ambit of service tax, under the purview of service tax, has been increased across the board. So any service other than these specific 17 services mentioned in the negative list are now liable for payment of service tax. So this negative list includes services such as admission to entertainment events, amusement facilities, electricity transmission and distribution, preschool and higher education, if you're approved vocational trade education courses, renting for residential purposes, passenger transportation, so which includes metro rail, metered cabs, taxis and auto rickshaws, toll charges, and services rendered by the government or the local authority. Other than this, any other services are liable to pay service tax. So from these provisions that we have looked at earlier, which are the sectors which are likely to benefit? So we see benefits for B2B, B2C businesses which are collaborated with or incubated by or supplying to educational institutions that will benefit from these grant outlays. We see clear benefits for B2B, IT, ITES, media, content development businesses which are supplying products and services to the larger educational players that have already received or are likely to receive NSDC funding. Access to growth capital. The Finance Minister announced the setting up of an India Opportunity Fund with a corpus of 5,000 crore for MSMEs to be managed by SIDBI. So this should improve the prospects of late-stage growth companies to raise capital from SIDBI. However, there's no mention of the record of banks financing MSMEs. There was a task force which has been set up by the Prime Minister, which went specifically into the problem of small, medium-sized businesses having difficulty in raising capital from banks and financial institutions. And they had recommended that the level of financing, the exposure that banks have to small and medium enterprises should increase to 13% by March 2013 as against 8% in March 2010. One of the most important features which was announced in this budget was the removal of restriction on investment by venture capital funds. So earlier the SEBI registered venture capital funds were permitted to invest only in certain specified sectors, 9 sectors like nanotechnology, IT hardware and software, seed research and development, biotechnology, R&D chemical entities, in order to avail of the benefits under the provisions of 1023 B, FB. So this is actually the provision with respect to withholding tax or dividend distribution tax. So earlier, any venture capital fund which invested in a company or a business which was not engaged in any of these areas would be subjected, so the investors in these funds would be subjected to the deduction of dividend distribution tax at 2 points. One was at the level of the company that made profits and declared dividends and wrote a check for the venture capital fund, and at the second level when the venture capital fund in turn declared a profit and a dividend to its own investors. So therefore, at a dividend distribution tax rate of 16.61%, the effective, when this deduction happened at 2 levels, effectively the final investor received only 69.54. So more than 30% was cut at the distribution tax level. So there is a relief now because investors will who have invested in funds which are going to take an exposure in any sector in the form of venture capital investment will have to pay lower dividend distribution tax. So this announcement of pass-through status is likely to increase the level of investment in business ventures by venture capital funds. So this is good news. Finally, we come to the aspect of the impetus for globalizing businesses. Now, we are all aware that there are something like more than 8,000 companies which are ITS related companies which are in the STPI. The budget 2011-12, that's the previous budget, had already announced the end of the tax holiday. And from 1st April 2011, STPI units were required to pay MAT at 18.5%. In this current budget, there are no further reliefs or benefits for such entities. The only one being that the turnover limit has been increased for the exemption from MAT as well as tax audits has been increased from 60 lakhs to 1 crore. Other than that, there is nothing else that this budget has to offer in terms of incentivizing these service-oriented companies to go global or expand their business. So as we are aware that of the 8,000, more than 8,500 software companies operating, more than 85% of them are exporting, and clearly something could have been done to encourage these entities. Finally, some general remarks on the budget, on the economy and the things that the budget has said and done or left undone. The economy as a whole is not strong. Public savings rate has stagnated. Investment gearing has slowed down. The fiscal deficit is high, and most of you are aware of the fact that this is going to result in India's sovereign rating being lowered, which will increase the cost of debt capital. The hesitation in announcing policies, in carrying out reforms, in backtracking on certain policy announcements increases the risk of uncertainty doing business in India, and therefore the equity risk premium, and this will affect the private sector as well. And obviously the high current account deficit, the negative trade balance, and which is insufficiently compensated through the inflow of capital. As you are aware, a large NRI expat population was remitting a part of their income to India. But since these economies where some of these NRIs and expats are residing are in turn going through a slowdown, so the level of remittances have come down. So overall, it's not a very good sign for inflows, a lot of money flowing in from the remittances. And in this budget, the government has given no clear indication on how to make India more foreign capital friendly. Thank you very much to all the participants, the audience, and I hope I have been able to address some of your questions, and I hope you were able to are able to go back with a little more information about the budget and a little more clarity on how you can go ahead now and run forward with your business. Thank you very much.